The following is a summary of the Sicha of Shabbos Parshas Chukas Tov Shin Nun. In the Parsha of Chukas, there's something which is quite astonishing when we look at the order of the Parshios. The Parsha of Bamidbar, which is at the very beginning, that was said in the month of Iyar, on the first day of the Chodesh Hasheni Bashana Hashenis. And Ein Mukdam U'Mucha b'Torah, there's no chronological order in the Torah, but all the other Parshias after Bamidbar are actually written in order. So Nosai was said on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, so Tzaves B'nei Yisrael, Vishalchem and Amachan, etc., was said Rosh Chodesh Nisan. On the Yom Shehukam HaMishan, it was said Vahi B'Yom Kalis Moshe, when Moshe finished. So all of it was said on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Parshas Bahaloischa, the Parsha of the Neiras, the Levim, the Tmeim, those who were sent out, those Pesach Sheni, that was one of the 8 Parshas which was also said on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. And as we move along in Parshas Bahaloischa, you've got Bashana Hashenis, B'Chodesh Hasheni, on the 20th of the month, Chof Iyar. So as you see, this progression, Rosh Chodesh Nisan, Iyar, Parsha Shlach, the Shiluach HaMeraglim, was on the 29th of Sivan. Parshas Koirach, when the Meraglim came back, was on Tisha B'Av. So from Parshas Nosoi on, everything is like in a Seder. Rosh Chodesh Nisan, then going into Iyar, and then in Shlach into Sivan, and Koirach into Av. However, we find in Parshas Chukas an anomaly. Because Parshas Chukas begins with the Parah Aduma, which was one of the 8 parshas which is said on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, which was many months before all the events in Parshas Shlach and Parshas Koirach. And in fact, the question is even greater when we consider after what is said in the Parsha of Chukas, after the Parsha of Parah Aduma. It says, Vayovoyu b'nei Yisrael kol ha'eda midbar sin. And Rashi says that this happened after all the people who needed to die in the desert because of the Chet HaMeraglim had died. Vayovoyu b'nei Yisrael kol ha'eda ha'ir ha'har, says Rashi, kulam shleimnim va'oimdim likonis la'aretz. In other words, this is talking about happenings at the end of the 40 years in the desert. The death of Miriam, the death of Aaron, the conquest of Sicha Chukas, and the encampment in Arvos Moav. So, the happenings at the end of this 40 years stay in the desert are at the end of the Parsha of Chukas, and at the beginning of the Parsha, you've got a Parsha which was said on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. So you've got from one end of the stay in the desert right to the other end, starting off in Parshas Chukas with Parah Aduma, which was said Rosh Chodesh Nisan at the beginning of the 40 years, and the rest of the Parsha talking about events that took place at the end of the 40 years. It's like a jump in one Sedra, literally from one side of the 40 years to the other side of the 40 years. Now, true, Rashi says in reference to the death of Miriam, Lama Nismacha Misas Miriam, Parah Aduma. What's the juxtaposition of the death of Miriam to Parah Aduma to tell you that just like Karbonos Mechaprim, so to Misas Sadikim is also Mechaper? However, the fact is that many other events are brought after the death of Miriam. And it's mistaber to say that in fact all those events are also connected with the Parsha of Parah that took place at the beginning of the 40 years. So we'll be able to understand this by asking another question. At the end of the Parsha of Chukas, there's a description of the conquest of Sicha Chukas. Vayishlach Moshe l'ragel es Yazer, vayilkudu b'nei Seha, vayiresh esu Ameri asher sham. Moshe sent Meraglim, spies, to go to Yazer, and they conquered it, and they inhabited the land over there. So Rashi says that the Meraglim said, that Moshe sent now, said, we're not going to be like the original Meraglim, Betuchim anu b'tvilasa, b'koyach tvilasa shel Moshe lihilachem. The original Meraglim came back with a bad report, and because of that there was a gezerah to stay 40 years in the desert. We, however, are sure in the power of the tefillah of Moshe, and we are going to literally conquer it. Now, the obvious question is that if they were sent only to spy out Yazer, why did they change from that shlichus and they actually went and conquered it? And in fact, if you analyze the Chet HaMeraglim, the sin of the Meraglim was that they deviated from the shlichus. Moshe told them to spy out the land. They didn't just spy it out, but they came and gave a negative report. They came to a maskana about whether or not it would be able to conquer the land. So that was, if they changed the shlichus, they deviated from the shlichus, and they were punished, how come here the shluchim that were sent to Yazer also deviated and they conquered? They were not told to do that. Furthermore, at the end of the parasha it says, Vayeshev Yisrael b'chol orei ha'emeri b'cheshben b'chol b'nei seha, Vayeshev Yisrael be'eretz ha'emeri v'yirushu ha'aretz ha'shaloi, that the Yidden conquered and settled in the land of Og. Now, this land of Sichon and Og was eventually given to the Bnei Gad and Bnei Ruvain, and they built their cities, and the idea of building a cities just emphasizes the strength of the acquisition and the inhabiting of the land. Now this itself is very, very strange. In many, many psukim, Moshe tells the Yidden that they are going to go into the land of Canaan, which is to the west of the Yarden. And the Meraglim was sent, the original Meraglim was sent, Losur es Eretz Canaan, which was to the west of the Yarden. The lands to the east of the Yarden, Eretz, Edom, Ammon, and Moav, and even Sichon, it says, Vayishlach Yisrael malachim el Sichon, Lemer Ebra batzach, let us pass through your land, Adash navar gevulach, until we go through your borders. It was only when they refused permission for them to go through that they fought with them. However, it was never their intention to settle there on the east side of the Yarden. And if that is the case, it's astonishing how and why did the Bnei Reuven, Gad, and Chatzi Shevet Menashe go and settle on the eastern side of the Yarden, when they all knew that the Ratzon Hashem was for them to cross to the west of the Yarden and to settle in the land of Canaan. Furthermore, the request of the Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven almost parallels that of the Meraglim. The Meraglim didn't want to go into the land, and if the Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven, knowing that the problem with the Meraglim was they didn't want to go into the land, how come they also claimed a land which is on the east of the Yarden? It's almost repeating the sin of the Meraglim. True, the reason why they asked that is because they had a lot of sheep. However, how can one possibly say that because they have a lot of sheep, they're going to give up something which is for their own good, for the good of their wives and for the good of their children? It would have been for their own good and the good of their families to go into Eretz Yisrael. Just because of the sheep, they had to stay to the east. That's Hepach HaSeichel, and particularly the Seichel of a Dordei, of a knowledgeable generation. And the biggest question is that Moshe agreed. Moshe agreed to their request. And even though Moshe compared them to Meraglim on one level, that was, however, only that the Bnei Gad and Reuven shouldn't destabilize and get the other Bnei Yisrael afraid. However, once they reassured them that they would go in and fight for them and then they would come back to the east, everybody was happy. Moshe agreed. Hayitachen. Why is that? Surely the idea is to go and settle to the west of the Yarden. The answer is that when it says that all of them were ready to go into the land after the death of all the people who died in the desert, then it's absolutely sure that nobody here wanted to repeat the sin of the Meraglim. On the contrary, what they set out to do here was to fix the sin of the Meraglim. So now we can understand why those Meraglim who were sent to Yazer didn't just look at it and spy it out, but they conquered it. Why? Because they wanted to emphasize we are not like the original Meraglim who came to the conclusion that we cannot conquer the land. Davko us, we want to go there and conquer it. And the tikkun always has to be in the same way that the chet was. And since the chet was that they came to a maskana, a conclusion which was undesirable, now these Meraglim that were sent to Yazer came to the conclusion that was good and desirable, that they should actually conquer it because they could rely on the power of the tefillah of Moshe. And now we also have the answer in reference to the Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven, because their kavanah actually was to be mesakein, to correct the chet of the Doir HaMidbar. How so? By the bris bein habesarim, Avraham Avinu was promised ki lazaracha nosati es haaretz hazos min nahar Mitzrayim ad nahar hagadol nahar pros es hakeni ves haknizi ves hakadmoni. Rashi explains that in fact Avram was promised 10 nations, and although in Eretz Yisrael there were only the 7 nations, and the land, the 3 of Edom, Moav, and Ammon, which were Keni, Kenizi, and Kadmoni, were on the other side, Avram Avinu was promised that La'asid Lavoi, they would also be given to the Bnei Yisrael. So therefore we can possibly suggest that the reason why the Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven wanted to settle in the land to the east of the Yarden was because they actually wanted to bring the full fruition of the promise to Avraham Avinu by the Bris Bein Habesarim to fruition. They didn't just want that the Yidden should go into Eretz Yisrael and conquer the 7 lands. They wanted all the 10 lands. And therefore, that's why they requested the land of Sich and Oig, which includes also Ammon and Moav, as it says, Ammon and Moav tira b'sichon. And their kavanah was to be mesakin, to correct the chet of the Doir HaMidbar in a way which was very good. They didn't want to go into the land. They wanted to stay in the Midbar. However, here, the Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven, faket, they wanted the rest of Bnei Yisrael to go into that and get the nations, 7 nations, and they would have the shleimus of the other 3 nations to complete the full inheritance of Avraham Avinu. And this is why Moshe Rabbeinu ultimately agreed to their bakasha, to their request. Now, what was the connection between the settling in Keni, Knizi, and Kadmoni Davka to the Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven? The answer is they had miknerav, they had many sheep. In other words, they wanted to be oisik in a malacha that didn't involve too much tirda, too much involvement in the world. And here again is the tikkun to the Meraglim. The Meraglim originally didn't want anybody to go into the land. Why? Because they wanted everybody to be disconnected and to live in a spiritual bubble. However, the Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven, they said, no, that's not the tachlis. The tachlis is that the majority of the people should go into the land and live within the land. However, there needs to be a minority of the people who will be shepherds, who will be slightly disconnected from earthly matters. However, they will give the koyach to the others that they will be able to conquer the land. As the Mitzel Rebbe says, that the 7 umos in the land of Eretz Yisrael correspond to the 7 midos, and Keni, Knizi, V'Kadmoni correspond to the Gimel Moichin of Chochmah, Bina, and Das. The Ikar Avodah is the Burer of the 7 midos. However, ultimately there will also be the Burer of Keni, Knizi, V'Kadmoni, which is of Chabad. However, the koyach, in order to be mevara the zayin umes, comes from the Bnei Gad, Bnei Reuven, comes from the Chachma Bina Das. So to say it slightly differently, the difference between the birur of the Shaban Midas and the birur of the three Moichin is a difference between the birur through hisaskos in the world, involvement in the world, and a birur through being detached from the world. This is also hinted to in a Mishnah in Yodayim Peirit Beis Mishnah Gimel. There it says that Amanu Moyav Mahem B'Shvius. What's the din of Ammon and Moav and Shvis? Rabbi Tarfon was Geizer Masa Ani, that the Yaniya Yisrael should be Somech on these lands on Shvis. In other words, in Ammon and Moav, they should take Masa Ani in Shvis, which means that the Yidden who lived in Eretz Yisrael, they relied in Shvis on the Yidden who lived there in Sichon and Oig, and Al derech haremez in Avedas Hashem, aniim ein ani ela b'das. Anius, poverty, is also spiritual poverty. So the Aniya Yisrael, those who were lacking in Chachma, Bina, and Das, relied on those who were in the Eiver HaMizrachi, on the eastern side of the Yarden, which represents the Keni Knizvikadmoni, which is Chachma, Bina, and Das. So now we understand the connection between the Parshas Parah, which was said at the beginning of the 40 years of the Midbar, and all the other things in the Sedra, which was said at the end of the 40 years. The connection is because all of the things that happened at the end of the 40 years were in a situation where they were absolutely ready to go into the land, and it was as if they hadn't sinned just as it was at the beginning of the 40 years. And the interlude, what had happened in between, was gone, it was past. But now they had reached the same madrega as the beginning of the 40 years. In a way of chakika, chuka chakakti, it was impossible to separate, therefore, the Zayin Umais from the Gimel Umais, and they wanted to completely inherit all those lands. And here is the connection between what we're reading now in Parshas Chukas and the time that we're reading it in Chodesh Tammuz, and particularly the connection with Yud Beis Tammuz. All inyanim of Geula are connected with the Geula HaMitzvah v'Hashlema, especially the Geula of the Nasi Adar, which HaNasi Hu HaKoil, v'lo yosi bilvad Goal HaKadosh Baruch Hu on Yud Beis Tammuz. However, on Yud Beis Tammuz it was a Geula of Kol Yisrael, and from the Geula of Yud Beis Tammuz we come to the Geula La'alta L'Geula, because La'alta L'Teshuva we've already done Imdu Hachen Kolchem. And Hafotzes HaMayonis in Chatzi Kadar HaTachten, this is all a hachana to the Gilui Shleimas HaMoichin, which will be La'asid Lavei. And this is all in the 40th year of the Histalkus of the Frierdiker Rebbe, when Nasan Hashem Lachem Leiv Ladas and Einayim Lishmeya, Einayim Liros Vaznayim Lishmeya, which is the Shleimas of the Gimel Moichin. And certainly now we kulam oindim shleimim likones la'aretz. And this, included in this, is the standing strong on Shleimas Haaretz, which Hashem has already given miraculously to the Bnei Yisrael, through announcing that Koyach Masiv Higid La'amoi, that this was given to us by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the Goyim themselves actually know the truth of that, and they actually call the land Israel because of Sarisa Elokim, because Yidden had prevailed, and therefore there will be the Shleimas Haaretz, which is connected with Shleimas HaTorah and Shleimas Ha'am, and all of the above with a Hachana Masima to come into the Yerusha of the whole of Eretz Yisrael. Hamaisahu Iker Mefachim Tzarchit Tzibah B'Shabbos. We should all make the correct preparations for the Farbrengenishes of Yud Beis Tammuz, making good hachlotas in Shiurei Torah Barabim, and especially in the Torah of the Frierdiker Rebbe, Asara Sheyoshvim V'Oiskim B'Torah, and will then be zeicha to bring the Parah Asiris, which the Melech HaMashiach will make, Meher Yigale, Amen Ken Yehi Ratzon.